welcome to the Professor Bourbon Podcast. As always, I am the Scout, joined here by Professor Bourbon. Professor Bourbon, how are we doing tonight?
Class is in session. It's another day in paradise, baby.
Another day in paradise, sipping on the Lord's brown water. What do you got in your glass tonight, Professor Bourbon?
Tonight, what we're drinking is Knob Creek 12, a nice 12-year-old expression of Knob Creek that has the 9, the 12, the 15, and the 18, and amongst smaller barrels and quarter oaks and lots of stuff like that. Knob Creek's is one of my go-tos. I really enjoy all the Knob Creek expressions.
Yeah, this one for 100 proof is definitely one of my favorites for, I guess, what some people would consider a lower proof. It sounds kind of blasphemous to even think that 100 proof is low. But for a 100 proof bourbon, I think is one of my favorite drinkers. And a lot of people can't find this one on the shelf all the time. But one of my favorite products that Knob Creek makes. And I know that we've done the Knob Creek flight before at the library. The 9, the 12, the 15, and the 18. Do you know which one is Professor Bourbon's favorite off the top of your head? Because I don't remember.
I don't remember. We have to, and the cool thing about the blind is every time you do a blind, it's going to come up different. So that's the fun part of it. And I think as I recall, we went with like the 15 as opposed to the 18. But I don't. Well, that'll have to be something we'll have to pull off again to remember.
Yeah, I feel like the 18 we had spoken maybe had like a too much of the oak flavor, which some people talk about the older bourbons might pull out too much of that oak flavor and things like that. But those Knob Creeks are definitely a really good product. The scouting report this week down here, we had a decent week in the southeastern region. Not quite as heavy hitting as we have in the past, but definitely found a few good bottles. For Professor Bourbon, and actually another for a friend. I was in a local store and found one of these. This is a Maker's Mark cast strength. A lot of people wouldn't think there's anything special about this, but this is what Maker's fans call a dunked bottle. And from what I've been told, they dunk about 1 out of every 100 or 200 bottles. Nothing special about the actual juice in here. It's just the standard Maker's Mark cast strength. It just has a little bit more wax that comes down here over the body of the bottle compared to the normal one, which is up here. A good buddy of ours, Silly Dilly, is a huge Maker's guy, and he told me anytime I find a dunked bottle to go ahead and grab him one. So I don't know if Professor Bourbon's got anything on these dunked bottles or if he's found one in the wild before himself.
No, and I've never seen one in the wild. I think the class made one of those when we visited Maker's Mark. Because she's fumble-fingered and dunked the whole thing in. It's up there in the back, but I think everybody who goes to Maker's Mark wants to make a dunk. So it's if you ever get out there and get to Loretto, Kentucky, be sure to tour Maker's Mark, and you can dip your own bottle. And if you want to make a dunk, you can make a dunk.
Yeah, they'll tell you that you can't dunk, and there's something in the bottom. But if you go and you give it a good twist down there, you can get we call it the sweater. It's not quite a dunk. But you can put a sweater on your bottle. So give it a shot if you end up at Maker's.
And the campus is beautiful. The restaurant, the food was phenomenal. The tour is great, and it's a beautiful facility. And if you're ever in Loretto, Kentucky, or somewhere close, I'd strongly recommend that tour.
Yeah, I completely agree. It was one of my favorite distilleries we've done thus far, and looking forward to going back there sometime soon. The second bottle we got this week's scouting report, we actually had Green River recently that I found for you, but this is actually a single barrel. This is from Tap House Liquor Shop here in Atlanta. I know that you've been looking for a single barrel of this Green River, and they usually have really good picks at this store. Sorry for that noise. I got these nice little ornaments that come with some of their single barrel selections. Show off their little ornament right there. But yeah, you got anything on this Green River single barrel Professor Bourbon?
I've heard really good things about it. I have a couple of Green Rivers here of their standard stuff, which I really like a lot. And for the price, they usually come in relatively low. I think the MSRP is in the 30s or 40 for the Green River, and it's a really good new kind of up and comer that I have a bottle here back here somewhere. There it is over there on the shelf over there. It's it's really enjoyable. It's an easy sipper, and it's got some good character to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to trying that. I haven't tried either one of them. They've both been sitting here waiting to make their way on up to the library. So I'm looking forward to opening both of those bottles. The next one we have coming in, I don't know a whole lot about. It comes from Starlight Distillery. This is Huber's Cigar Batch Single Barrel. Another one that was kind of on Professor Bourbon's list for me to be on the lookout for. So what you got for me on this Huber's Cigar Batch?
I recently read some really good stuff about it. I've never had it, but I read some good stuff about it when we kind of mentioned it, and I'm anxious to give that one a shot. I saw some really good things about it, and some people that had tasted in some of the other forums that exist on the YouTubes and the internet and the podcasts that are doing all the tasting and rankings and stuff have given it some pretty good reviews. So I thought, why not? And we'll when after we taste it, maybe we'll sip it one day, right, and figure out what it's like. A library has to have books in it or bourbon in it, and to be a library, so might as well increase the collection.
That's right. We're always adding books into that library. My favorite library to read at, if you will. But the last bottle we have coming from this week's scouting report comes from what I believe is probably both of our favorite distilleries that we've been to on the trail so far. We go there every year that we go to the trail. This is coming from Bardstown Collaborative Series. This is the Foursquare collaboration that Bardstown did. So if you want to give a little bit more information about this bottle, I know I'm super excited about this one. But what has Professor Bourbon got on this?
The Foursquare, the collaboration, we have a couple other collaboration series up here over that way in the Bardstown in the Bardstown shelf in the library, but this one is a blend of two different whiskeys rested in or aged in Barbados rum casks for about 23 months, I believe. And it's made up of an Indiana rye and a Tennessee bourbon, and the rye is 7-year-old rye, and the Tennessee bourbon is 17-year-old. And so this one, again, this is one of those. A lot of stuff about Bardstown is interesting because they're really not on the unicorn lists. They're not on people's they're not things that people are seeking out, and that makes it good because usually you can find the stuff at what their MSRP is, and I mean it's relatively. I think the MSRP is $150, and I think that's what we paid for it, and it's a really. I mean, I've not been disappointed in anything I've had from. There's never been anything from Bardstown that I've had that I like. Oh, I don't know if I should have gone there, and I have some really interesting things from Bardstown. So I'm always happy to find something new from Bardstown.
Yeah, I like the collaboration series they're doing too. A lot of them are finished in different rum barrels and things like that, which kind of gives it an interesting finish and a different take on the taste of that bourbon. And like you said, I don't think we've ever had a bad one that's come from Bardstown. So anytime you can get your hands on any of their products, I'd go ahead and recommend trying those out. But what has Professor Bourbon read this week? Is there anything interesting that's been in bourbon news? Anything you heard on a podcast or maybe read in the news or saw that's hitting the bourbon streets this week?
Yeah, last week we talked about the Justin's House of Bourbon in Kentucky and the little bit of jam up they were in with the Kentucky Alcoholic Beverage ABC. And it turns out this week that the hearing officer scheduled to hear the Justin's Bourbon case against Justin's House of Bourbon has recused himself, or there's a potential conflict of interest because the value of his own bourbon collection could be impacted by the ruling. Apparently, this guy, Sean Chapman, trying to make sure I got the right name here, kind of looking through some notes here, is the hearing was scheduled on February 21st, and the hearing officer had a conflict of interest because apparently he has a pretty good bourbon collection, and the ruling he would make would affect the value of the bourbon that Justin's House of Bourbon has, which in would turn affect his bourbon. So it's in the recusal. The quote he said is well known that certain rare, older, or otherwise collectible bottles of bourbon and other distilled spirits can be quite valuable, which has led to various black markets where unlicensed persons sell the bottles for many times their retail cost. One of the legal questions in this case against Justin's House of Bourbon is whether certain bottles are rare older distilled spirits, including brands and bottlings that currently are regularly produced but are rarely available from a wholesale, constitute vintage distilled spirits that may legally be sold by an unlicensed person. And this guy owns a bunch of vintage distilled spirits. So apparently his decision could affect the value of his bourbon collection. So he's been recused from that, and they have a new hearing officer, and that's going forward in this. I think I read this in Kentucky.com, looking at my notes here really quick. And they're in a battle of, as we said last week, there's at least $100,000 in rare and vintage bourbons. And we talked a little bit last week about the problem they had of confiscating and storing the barrels or the bottles, and having ruined or destroyed some of the bottles, at least according to Justin's House of Bourbon. So that's a little bit of an update on what's going on there. So that's kind of what I've looked at and read this week.
Yeah, it seems like this case is going to carry a lot more weight in the future of, redistribution or selling secondary bottles. I didn't realize that this case might be that important. But it's very interesting that, the hearing officer just happens to have a really nice collection of vintage bottles at his house. And the outcome of this case could very well determine, how the legality of selling those bottles one day, which will then determine what the secondary market is on those bottles. So I guess it's a good thing that he decided to recuse himself at the point he did.
And the interesting thing here, too, is in a meanwhile, kind of further down in this article, Kentucky lawmakers are considering legislation designed to make large-scale vintage sales and purchases of rare bourbons illegal. So that means basically you have these markets that are collectible markets for whatever reason, and now these people are going to have collectible bourbon and vintage bottles that they can't sell anymore. So essentially that makes the value of anything you own is what other people are willing to pay for it. And if they can't pay for it, that's going to destroy a lot of the value of a lot of things in this collectible market. And I don't, from an economic standpoint, I don't really understand why there's this. The bourbon's already been sold. It already has its tax label on it. The state has collected its tax. Does it really matter that private sellers are trading these things back and forth with each other after they've already been bought, after the tax has already been paid, and all those sorts of things? Very similar to the case we talked about last week of the bootlegger in Virginia. If I own a boat and I want to sell it to you, why can't I sell it to you? If I bought a bottle of, the Tornado E.H. Taylor and I got it and I don't want it anymore and you're willing to give me $5,000 for it, I don't understand the beef there. The taxes have already been paid, all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of weird to me. I don't fully understand why. I imagine I can make up a story about why, and we can talk a little bit about that more in economics a little bit later. We'll talk about some public choice economics and some things like fancy words like transitional gains traps and externalities and things like that. We'll do an episode on a bunch of stuff like that. I'll bring in some experts in public choice economics and we'll do a podcast with those people a little bit later.
Yeah, it's very interesting that that's one of the few things that's regulated for resale, along with the, off the top of my head, I can think of like automobiles and things like that are regulated by the government for resale. And it's kind of interesting that, they have that much interest in this. Like you said, once the tax has already been paid and sold by that original purchase, what business is it if I have that bottle and want to sell it to my buddy down the street? Why is it illegal for me to be able to do that? But if I have a chair that I bought from Haverty's last week and I don't want that anymore, I can sell that on Facebook Marketplace to Martha down the street, and they don't care about that. So the implications of this case actually could trickle down pretty deep into the bourbon market. It'll be interesting to see kind of how it affects some of those super rare bottles if they do say, hey, these stores that a lot of us call museums that have bottles sitting there for secondary prices, you're not allowed to sell those bottles anymore. There's going to be a lot more available on the quote unquote black market, secondary market for bourbon prices. So it'll be interesting to see how those kind of fluctuate and see how this kind of trickles down top to bottom, depending on what happens with this case. But speaking of regulations and of bourbon and things like that, I figure since we're still early in the podcast, it'd be good for us to have an episode where we kind of go over what makes a bourbon and kind of the bourbon making process, not to get too scientific or too in depth with that. But just where our listeners that maybe are just getting into it and haven't done the bourbon trail and haven't gotten that same spiel that, you'll end up getting every time you go on a tour. What makes a bourbon? What are the regulations that are seen with that? Yeah, I know. Professor Bourbon's laughing because at one point we actually did a bingo card because we had heard the same spiel at every distillery. So we were trying to find ways to keep it interesting for us. But yeah, for those that don't know, on very basic terms, what makes a bourbon a bourbon?
So bourbon, all bourbon is whiskey. Not all whiskey is bourbon. And what a whiskey is typically a distilled spirit of cereal grains. So things like wheat, corn, barley, rye, things like that. And that's usually what makes. So you distill a mash of cereal grains, which is mixed with water, and then yeast, typically some malted barley to help speed up the yeast process, and the yeast ferments. Basically, the interesting thing about whiskey and beer is they start out the same. You throw some yeast in with the malted barley, which adds some of the sugars that the yeast can get, and the wheat and the other grains in pounded, mashed up, and turned into a fine powder and mixed with water and the yeast, and you let them ferment for a while. When they're done fermenting, you get what's called distiller's beer, or in the case of beer, and then the process differs from there. And so what makes bourbon is a couple of things. That first, bourbon has to have in the mash bill, and the mash is the mixture of the grains that are used that are fermented and in the mixture of the grain. You have to have at least 51% of the mixture has to be corn, and the rest of it can be rye or barley or wheat. And there are some bourbons. There's some 5-grain bourbons. We have one called Anita's Choice, I think, that comes out of Savannah, that has a rice in it. And I think there's some bourbons I'm trying to remember the name, out of Louisiana, that have rice in them, and rice is a cereal grain, and so there are cereal grains and different grains in them, and of course there's lots of varieties of wheat and corn that change the flavor profile and stuff. And so though after the fermentation part, then the distiller's beer is then distilled, and to be bourbon, it can't be distilled at more than 160 proof. So it has to be distilled at less than 160 proof, and then it has to go into a new charred oak barrel at less than 125 proof, 125 proof or lower. And the species of the charred oak barrel is not stated by the federal government in their definitions of bourbon, but typically it's American white oak, and it has to be the first use of the barrel, and it goes in, and it's and they're charred. And we can have one day. We hope to visit a cooperage on our next trip there to talk about char levels and the way the barrels are put together. And apparently American oak is really good for watertight barrels, better than other types of oak. And then it has to age in that barrel, and there's no minimum aging. You could pour the and what they call when the final distillate comes off of the still is the white dog, or you think of it as kind of in the old days like moonshine, but moonshine's usually 100% corn, and that whatever comes off that still could go right through a new charred oak barrel. Just pour it right through, pour it out the other end, and it would be bourbon. But nobody wants to drink a bourbon that's aged for 5 minutes. So then there's a couple other limits, that if it's going to be called straight bourbon, it has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years in the barrels. And if its age is less than 4 years, it has to be said somewhere on the label of the bourbon that it's aged for less than 4 years. The other thing that bourbon can't be is it can't have any additives or colors added to it, and it can only be cut with water. So the only thing you can proof it down with is water. So most bourbon's going to come out of the barrel. If it's going into the barrel, and different distilleries do it at different barrel entries, the proof that they put it in the barrel at, they cut it down, cut the proof down, and then when it comes out of the barrel, it's going to be a higher proof because the evaporation process is going to typically make it a higher proof than it went into the barrel. And then the distillery is going to cut that and it can only cut it with water. And as we heard on one of our bingo cards, that Kentucky sits on one of the largest limestone shelf in North America, and the limestone shelf filters the water in such a way as to get rid of all the impurities and makes the bourbon taste extra special, because that's the water that's used in the mash bill, in the fermentation process, in the cutting process of the bourbon. And there's a couple other rules too that go into bourbon. We can talk a little bit more about that. We'll explore the Bottled in Bond Act and age statements and things like that. But no, again, if a bourbon's under 2 years, it has to say so on the label somewhere. If it's over 2 years, it doesn't. If it's straight bourbon, it has to be at least 2 years. And as I understand it too, if it's called Kentucky straight bourbon, it has to be at least 4 years old. And then it can rest in barrels as long as possible. And that's what makes bourbon different than other whiskeys. Most whiskeys, again, all whiskeys are distilled from mash bills of cereal grains. So a rye, typically what makes a rye is it has to have more than 51% of its mash bill be rye. And so that's what makes a rye, and then it goes in the barrel. All of the whiskey that comes off of the still or the White Dog is clear. It's clear liquor. All of the color and everything it gets from the barrels. So in the U.S. with the brand new charred barrels, it typically doesn't have to say age as long as it does say with a Scotch, which can go into lots of different kind of other barrels. And Irish whiskey has the same rules, and there's rules about things that make Irish whiskey, Scotch, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what makes a bourbon a bourbon. All bourbon is whiskey, not all whiskey is bourbon.
Right. And I think before we're going to get a little deeper into the whiskey making process tonight, but I know a lot of people are probably wondering as you're going through this, why the hell are there so many rules on what makes a bourbon a bourbon? And I think we could really briefly just visit that before we keep moving on. And as far as I know, it's basically from Prohibition, bourbon wanted to keep its integrity as a product. And so at a certain point, you didn't know when you were buying a bourbon if you were getting something that was legitimate from a distillery or if you were getting something that was from Tom from down the street that might turn your toes blue or, might blind you or do something like that. So why are there so many of these regulations? And again, we'll go into this further into another episode, but just briefly, kind of explain why there's so many regulations that determine what is a bourbon.
The interesting thing is in economic theory, we call this capture, where the regulators are captured, quote unquote, by the people they're regulating, because the people who are being regulated kind of like the regulation. Lots of people think that when you regulate something, the people that are being regulated don't like it. So I'll give you a kind of more modern example. You've heard recently, if you think about social media, Mark Zuckerberg and Meta, I guess Facebook Meta, whatever you want to call it, would regularly go to Congress and say, no, please regulate us because we're evildoers and we need to be regulated. And if you think about why Zuckerberg wants to be regulated, is any regulation we come up with, he's gonna be the one that's gonna help write the regulation, and he has plenty of lawyers to make sure he's following the regulation. So it helps prevent whiskey. It helps prevent people from entering into the market. So if we think about when bourbon was first called bourbon, right? And there's a lot of legends about where the name of, and one of the really cool things about bourbon and bourbon history is it's full of a lot of nonsense and sense, and you have to figure out it's a lot of myth, a lot of legend, and why it's called bourbon. There's a theory that the reason it's called bourbon is Bourbon County, Kentucky. There's a reason it's called bourbon is somebody said once in when they found out they could float the barrels on flatboats out the Kentucky River over to the Mississippi and float it down to New Orleans, that people really liked the whiskey that was on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, right? Because remember, this is all House of Bourbon from France. And they would go, man, I want some of that bourbon whiskey, which was the whiskey they were drinking on Bourbon Street, which happened to come from Kentucky. So that's how it got its name. But the first mention of the word bourbon whiskey was in 1821 from the Western Citizen newspaper. So that was the first mention of the idea of bourbon or the word bourbon in there. And so now when we start going off, bourbon takes a while to produce. As you saw, it takes 2 years minimum for something to be straight bourbon. And when you distill a product, you can't sell it for a couple of years. So one way to cheat the process would be what at the time were people called rectifiers. And what rectifiers did was take a white dog or a whiskey that was new off the still, and they might mix it with colorings and caramel flavors and caramel colorings, and similar to the stuff like we see now, the flavored whiskeys we see now. Think about Fireball and what's the peanut butter one? I can't remember what's the peanut butter one though. Screwball. And there's lots of whiskeys that are flavored whiskeys, and what they are is you take the white dog and you mix them with some flavor and some color, and you give them some color. So if you're a bourbon distiller, you don't want those guys doing that, because they're going to compete directly with you, and they could get their stuff. It doesn't take long to run a distilling run, have it come out, and then change the color of it, give it some taste, and then send it out as bourbon. So there was there was a bourbon trust formed in Lexington in the 1840s or 1850s, I believe. We'll have one of my former students come on, and I hope podcast sometime to talk about that. He's doing a lot of research in the history of bourbon. And so they wanted to change the law initially not to allow rectifiers. So that's why you see nothing can be added to bourbon, no color, no flavoring, no anything. So that was one of the first laws that got passed to do that. So, and as we went further along, more and more laws got passed, and there's a lot of really interesting history in terms of the way that worked all the way up through the Food and Drug Act of 1906 or something like that. So there's a lot of really cool things that develop in American food and drug stuff that are developing parallel to bourbon at the same time.
And it's made this really cool product that's very specific to what it can be. And obviously it's an American-made product. It's something you can only find. Bourbon's something you can only find that's made here. So it's kind of unique in that sense that it has all of those regulations and those rules that kind of keep it within those boundaries of being a bourbon. And so we've kind of talked about, the mash bill and what goes into a mash bill and the distillate process, coming out as a white dog. So once that white dog goes into the barrels, obviously a lot of the determining factor will be what goes into the mash bill and where that barrel may be stored. But I was going to let you go into a little bit more detail about the aging process and what really happens with that liquor and that alcohol when it's inside the barrels, whether it be for 2 years or 7 years, or once we get into some of those products that we're talking about, the 15 or the 20-year products, kind of how the aging affects the bourbon inside.
No, it's real quick as an add-on too. A lot of people think that bourbon can only be distilled and made in Kentucky, and that's not true. Bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States. So anything that has the same mash bill and doesn't come from the United States can't be bourbon. So and we can talk about this one day too, maybe an offshoot on Japanese whiskey, but the Japanese are really good at copying and learning and doing things. And there's a lot of Japanese whiskeys that are bourbons, except they don't come from the U.S., so they can't be called bourbon. So similar, Scotch whiskey has to come from Scotland. Irish whiskey has to come from Ireland. So there's rules. So bourbon can come from anywhere in the U.S., but people will tell you the standard number people throw out is about 95% of bourbon is distilled and aged in Kentucky. And so, most of the bourbon, that's a number that people throw out. I'm not sure that it's a number that somebody counted up and actually measured, but 95% of the bourbon is made in Kentucky. So the second part of the process after the distillation and if you want to look more into distillation, you can look at the difference between distilling pot stilled and column stilled, and some things are distilled in both. If you think about what a pot still is think about the old copper thing when you think about moonshine, the big round copper or rounded shaped copper with the coil coming out of the top of it that you boil the mash bill in, and the water and alcohol boil at different temperatures, and so they vaporize at different temperatures, and then you cool the vapor and it goes back into a liquid, and that's where you get the alcohol. In a column still, there's a series of plates, and the column is really, really tall. The difference is in a column still, you can operate it continuously, so you can keep putting in more distiller's beer, and it can run all the time. A pot still gets run in batches, so you run it for a while. Then when that batch is done, you got to clean it all out, climb in, clean it all out, and then restart a new process. And once that's all done, it goes into barrels. All of the color of the whiskey obviously comes from the barrel, because you can't put anything else in, and the barrel is charred and it sits in the barrel and ages. And when it's sitting in the barrel in a climate like Kentucky, where it is cold in the winter and warm and humid in the summer, if you think about the liquid in the barrel, it's stuck inside of a barrel, and when it gets warm, the barrel's going to expand. Like anything, when it gets warm, expands, and the liquid expands, and it pushes itself into the wood of the barrel, which is where it gets its color, and the oak, the tannins, and the vanillins that are all in oak trees. And that's where it picks up the flavors of the brown sugar and the vanilla and the chocolate, and all that comes from the wood sugars, because there are sugars in the wood. And then in the winter, when it gets cold, the whiskey comes back, constricts, and the whiskey comes back out of the barrel. So as the seasons age, the whiskey goes into and pushes out and comes in, pushes out and comes in to the barrel, and all the time we're losing part of it because the barrels aren't airtight or vapor tight. Some of it's going to leak out, and if you've ever been in a rick house, you can smell the smell is just fantastic, because you can smell the grain and the cereal and the sugar. And you look at the barrels, and they're all kind of coated with this sap on the outside of them. And so the barrels, so they lose about, I think it's about 10% per year as they age. So if you have a 55-gallon barrel, you're going to lose, say 5 gallons in the first year, and 4.5 or 5 in the next year, and 4. And so, and if you think about a bourbon that's aged for 10 years and it's losing 5 or 8% a year, 55 gallons turns into about 20 couple gallons by the time it's all done. And so you're losing about 8 to 10% of the alcohol by volume in the first year. And then of course it'll go down, because as the barrel gets soaked, it's going to change a little bit. But you could end up with 30 gallons in a 55-gallon barrel after time. And they kind of colloquially call the bourbon that seeps out, the bourbon that seeps out of the barrel, as the angel's share. And so when you're all done, if you keep a bourbon in a barrel for 20 years, a 55-gallon barrel might have 20 20, 22, 23 gallons when you're all done because of that. And so, and I just thought of something really quick too. There's no reason that bourbon has to be aged in a barrel. It can just be the rule says an oak cask. So it'd be weird to make a square box to put bourbon in, because there's a reason barrels are round. And if you've been to a warehouse or a rick house, as they call them, you know why, because they're easy to roll and then they're easy to turn because of the belly in the middle. That's why barrels are bellied in the middle. So if you think about rolling them around, they can spin them on their edges and move them a little bit easier. And then we just mentioned the Angel Share. Another thing that, and you see Jim Beam has a product called this, the Devil's Cut. They, if there's the Angel Share, that's the whiskey that dissipates off into the sky. When you're all done and you dump the barrel, if you can take the barrel and some of the liquid stays trapped in the wood, and if you can get a process to soak the barrel in water or something and get the liquid to come back out of the oak by extracting it, you get what's called the Devil's Cut, and that's the bourbon that sticks in the barrel. And if you go to a distillery and go into a tour or go into a place, typically they'll have a barrel that's cut in half, and they'll show you how deep the whiskey goes into the barrel. And it could be, if a barrel stave is, an inch thick, it could be half of that and 3/4 of that, and you can see where the line of the barrel goes in there. So it's all of the flavor, not all of the flavor, a good amount of the flavor, and that's not grain related, comes all from the barrel aging and then charring and all that sort of stuff. So that's what makes bourbon bourbon.
And I think one of the interesting things, just to add on to that, that we learned when we were on the bourbon trail, is some people ask, why are certain products so much more expensive than other products from distilleries? And it's not always necessarily this product is more sought after than another product, or this might be a better product than another. But we learned that the distilleries are actually taxed on the alcohol that goes into the barrel, not what comes out of the barrel. So they're taxed on 50, if you're using a 55-gallon barrel, like you mentioned, they're taxed on 55 gallons of bourbon, no matter what comes out of that barrel. So if they pull that bourbon out after 4 years, they're probably going to get the most out of, the most bang for their buck. They're probably going to get 50 gallons or close to, maybe a little bit less than that, 45, 50 gallons, something like that, if they take it out after 4 years. But if they wait and they take it out after 7 years, after 10 years, after 15 years, that flavor is going to be significantly better, but they're also going to have significantly less product inside that barrel. Therefore, they have to charge a little bit more because they've already been taxed on the product that went into that barrel. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's close. I mean, that's really close. Is you're not gonna leave bourbon in a barrel for 10 years if you don't think you can recoup the taxes that you paid on the front end, right? So there's no reason to leave it in 10 years and get $40 if 4 years is $40, right? And since people are willing to pay more for aged bourbon, it makes sense for a distiller to leave it in there longer, right? So if you think about, the distillers are taxed per barrel year over year. So if a barrel of bourbon's been aging for 10 years, its owner has paid the barrel tax 10 times, right? So there's another piece of it. And Kentucky distillers, at a rate of about a nickel per $100 in value, on average, distillers pay about $200 in tax per barrel. So they're paying, and which is why they have to pay really close attention to what goes in and what comes out. And that's part of the bonded law, which an interesting part of when we talk about the Bottle and Bond Act, we keep teasing it, but we'll talk about it sometime, is it was a pushing off of delaying the taxes. So there was a trade-off that they were willing to, if they would bond the warehouses and they could ensure how much was going in and coming out of the barrel, they bought off. They kind of made a trade-off so they could pay taxes at a later date rather than an earlier date, rather than right when it went in, the taxes wouldn't be due till it came out. So that's part of the Bottle and Bond Act as well.
Right. And you mentioned that, distilleries aren't going to leave a product inside a barrel for 10 years unless they're pretty confident that they can pull something out of that barrel in 10 years that's worth the price that either the tax that they've paid, the time that it's spent taking up space in the rick house and things like that. So what's the importance of where that barrel is actually located in the rick house and how that affects the aging of that particular barrel and how they may leave certain barrels? I know that they'll try them over time, but how does where that barrel is located in the rick house itself kind of determine how that bourbon's going to age?
So that's a great question, and if you think about it, different distilleries have different theories on this, right? If you go to Maker's Mark, their rick houses aren't as tall, and they pride in moving barrels around, and they want all their barrels to age the same, which is why Maker's Mark is a fantastic, consistent product. You know exactly what you're getting all the time with Maker's Mark, and when you think about a rick house, right? The rick houses can be 5 or 6 stories tall. And if you've ever been in an attic in August in the South, well, even in the North, if you're in an attic in August and and you're above the insulation in the house, it's hot as, yes, it's very hot up there.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you think about the hotter it gets, the more you're going to have evaporating in the barrel. And then if you're on the lower floors, it's not going to be as hot in the summer. So then think about the opposite effects. If you've ever been in an attic in the winter, it's pretty doggone cold. So the barrels, if and a lot of distilleries don't rotate their barrels, think about what it would take to rotate a barrel. And the other thing is rickhouse construction is amazing. The guys that figured out how to put all these things together without the whole place collapsing, is the barrels on the top go through much more weather extremes than the barrels on the bottom. So the barrels on the very bottom floors are going to be more temperate, where the swing between summer and winter is not going to be as much. Whereas the barrels all the way on the top, the swing between summer and winter is going to be much greater temperature. So you're going to have a much greater push and pull, if you will. It's not exactly what happens, but close enough to the liquid going in and out of the barrel. And then the middle, a little bit in between there. So the barrels on the top are going to evaporate and have less bourbon at the end after the process than the barrels on the bottom than the barrels on the middle. And there are different barrel and different places in the rick house are going to give you different profiles, and a really good master distiller knows where the profiles are in the top. So if you think about on the lowest floors where the temperatures are cooler, you get the opposite. So instead of having a lot of water disappear, you have you lose more alcohol on the lower floors because it's not as warm. So the proof actually drops on the lower floors and it rises on the upper floors. So you're going to get higher proof bourbons out of the upper floors and lower proof bourbons out of the bottom floors. And then when you're taking, a product where you're like a Buffalo Trace, where it's hundreds and hundreds of barrels mixed together, they're coming from all over the warehouse. And I'm always fascinated that somebody could take barrels from all over the place. I mean, I think they have over 1 million barrels stored at Buffalo Trace right now. Figure out which ones all go together, mix them all up, and make Buffalo Trace taste like Buffalo Trace all the time. That just is amazing to me. And I mean, I don't think we celebrate master distillers enough and their palates, because they're the ones that make sure that every time you open your bottle of Jim Beam White, it tastes like Jim Beam White. Every time you open your bottle of Buffalo Trace, it tastes like Buffalo Trace. And for some of us, the single barrel is a lot more fun. Like that bottle of Blanton's there is different than that bottle of Blanton's there is different than that one. So it's, all of those things matter in the way that the whiskey and the bourbon ends up tasting when it's all done and said.
Yeah, it's really cool the way the master distillers can figure out how to sometimes pull barrels from different areas to get that blend exactly right to make a consistent product, something like you're talking about with Buffalo Trace. Or there's other people that are, kind of snobs for certain warehouses or certain rick houses and they want it to be Western facing and things like that. And there are certain companies that'll give you that kind of information on the label. You'll see some, you might wonder, what are all these random numbers on this label? And a lot of times it'll be telling you what rick house it was in. what shelf it was on, and maybe even what direction it was facing. And all of that has a really determining factor on what that bourbon's going to taste like. And it's really cool that it's unique like that. And it's all dependent on the seasons, kind of how everything goes while that bourbon's inside the barrel. But I think what I'd like to kind of wrap up on, since we're kind of going into that, but on today's episode, the last thing, people being confused on a label. I know a lot of people have probably seen single barrel, small batch, bottled and bond, like you're talking about. We don't have to dive too deep into that because I know we could have a whole episode on that, but just really briefly give a basic explanation on when people happen to see small batch, single barrel. What does that mean when they see that on a label?
Single barrel is one, and I don't know that there's actual definitions from the TTB, and I have to check on that to confirm it. But typically, if it says single barrel, all of the bottles that you have are coming out of one barrel, and that could be somewhere, depending on how long it's aged, around 150 to 250 bottles that can come out of a barrel. If you think of a bottle as 750 milliliters, or a fifth, as we used to call it, which is a fifth of a gallon. So if you got 20 gallons, if you got 30 gallons left in the bottle and you got in the barrel and you got a fifth, you got 150 bottles. If you have 40 barrels left in it and you got a fifth, you got 200 bottles. So when you think of single barrel, that means all of the bottles came from one barrel, and they're going to have slightly different tastes from barrel to barrel. Not completely different, but slightly different taste from barrel to barrel to barrel, because every barrel is going to age differently. It's going to evaporate differently. The oak is going to interact with it differently. Small batch is one of those weird things that there's no definition of it. So I think Buffalo Trace, says small batch on its label, if you look at its label, and Jim Beam White doesn't. So what's a small batch? I think that's true. I think if you look at your, and if I'm wrong, you can cut it out of here. But I think if you look at the Buffalo Trace, it says small batch on it. I'm making you look over your shoulder whiskey. And look. Doesn't say small batch.
Just says straight bourbon whiskey.
All right, then we can cut that shit out of here. One of the problems with small batch is nobody knows what a small batch is. Is that 5 barrels, 10 barrels, 20 barrels, 30 barrels? So it's something less than, what makers would do to create their batches of stuff. It's going to be different than what Buffalo Trace would do to make Buffalo Trace. Unfortunately, there's no real definition of it. And this is one of the things that lots of people lament. Like, when you write small batch on the bottle, what does it mean? And there's no real rules for it. And I guess it just means there's not, 1,000 barrels going in to make this stuff or whatever. And so there's a little bit of control there. And so small batch is a little more boutique-y, if you will, right? And if you think about most craft distilleries, their stuff probably comes in at, if you're not at the massive Brown-Forman, who owns Jack Daniels and Buffalo Trace and Jim Beam, and doing their standard label stuff where there's thousands and thousands of barrels, you have slightly different things. Small batch can mean the processing and things like that, so it's all different, unfortunately.
Yeah, I saw a social media video recently, and they were at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, and they were going around to some of the bigger names in like podcasting, and they have websites and stuff like that, and they went around and asked everybody, what's the term in bourbon that you're either most annoyed by or sick of hearing? And about 95% of them, the first thing they said was small batch, because no one has any idea what it really means. And people that aren't into bourbon are always asking, should I buy this? It's a small batch. It's a small batch. What is small batch? That's good, right? Should I buy? It's a small batch. And it's kind of funny that everyone kind of has this same, like, yeah, I don't really know what it means. And it's this very loose term that none of us really pay attention to. So it's small batch. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you look at some of the Knob Creeks, they're small batches, right? I think some of the Knob Creek 9-year-olds are called small batches. So there's Knob Creek 9-year-old small batch, and it is one of the things when you talk to whiskey snobs, so to speak, that they would like just to get rid of that phrase because nobody knows what it means.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you what it means. Looking over my shoulder, there's several bottles I see. Castle and Key says small batch. I know there's a couple more up here, and I've never paid attention to what it means, so it doesn't move the needle for me. But I think later episodes, we may be able to go into a little bit more about bottling, the actual bottling, what goes into the labeling, and then distribution is one of the huge things that's, a very hotly contested point about the whole distribution process, about having to buy through distributors. I'm sure Professor Bourbon would love to talk about the absurdity that is being an ABC state and how they have to purchase, liquor from their own distillery and things like that. We can get into later. And Professor Bourbon obviously knows a lot more about that. And I'm sure you have some opinions on the distribution process, if I had to guess.
Yeah, definitely.
I would think so. But again, as we said before, if you guys can get on, we're on TikTok. We're on Instagram at professor.bourbon. You can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify. Any way you guys could like, comment, share, anything you guys could do would be awesome for us. Trying to get some guests coming here in the near future.
Don't forget subscribe. Like, comment,
Always
subscribe. Always subscribe.
Like, comment, and subscribe. Yes, you are absolutely right. I apologize about that. You got anything else for us tonight, Professor Bourbon?
No, just until next week or whenever we do this again. I'm looking forward to a big trip coming up, and we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But until then, sip bourbon. Class dismissed. Oh, look at you in the Norland class. Woo-hoo-hoo.